Hello everyone, welcome back to another whiteboard video. Before you look at all this, the purpose of this video is for you to learn how to exactly target your quads versus target your glutes and your hips in a leg press. We're going to go over all of this in a second, but I want to start by just saying that this doesn't have to be complicated. I'm going to leave you with a really simple takeaway. I just want to kind of explain and potentially debunk some of the common myths out there first. Okay, because it's important to understand from how I'm thinking about this process so that when you encounter anything in the gym, you're not going to have things that look exactly like I'm describing on my fancy diagrams here. You need to be able to think about it at a principle-based level, and how we do that is we address the nitty-gritty and then we sort of bring it out to a simple takeaway, a simple principle. Okay, so the two major things before we look at these diagrams that I hear people talking about when they're like, we target quads in a leg press or we target glutes in a leg press. People say, put your feet high for glutes. How many of you have heard that? Put your feet high for glutes and put your feet low for quads. That's pretty much the first thing, I think the most popular thing that people say. The second most popular thing people say is, well, to target quads, we need to maximize the knee bend, and to target the glutes, we need to maximize the hip bend, right? And there are really good nuggets in both of those things, and they're going to be important pieces to the puzzle, but ultimately they're not what will determine whether your quads or your glutes gets more stimulus and more fatigue as a consequence. So what will actually determine whether your glutes or your quads get more stimulus? Well, it's really about the force of the leg press, and specifically how you manipulate your foot position in relationship to that force. So here's what I mean. Imagine that this is situation one, where this happy guy or gal is doing a leg press and they have their foot positioned kind of like that. Well, a really simple and helpful question to ask whenever you're trying to figure these kinds of things out is, what is the foot plate trying to get my bones to do? Don't think about the muscles, think about the bones first. Take a bone first, a joint first approach. So when we think about what is this foot plate, assuming this foot plate is just kind of moving in this direction side to side, what is it trying to do to these bones? Well, in the case of leg pressing, we really need to just focus on two bones, the shin and the femur or the thigh, right? And we have to ask, what is the foot plate trying to do to the relationship between the shin and the thigh? In this particular case, if you imagine what it's trying to do, it's really just trying to, via the shin, push the femur back toward the belly. Okay, so a very simple way to see this would be like, imagine this is the shin and this is the femur, okay, like kind of like that. If something is pushing the shin marker like this, well, it's trying to push the black marker directly backward, right? So if the femur is getting smushed toward the belly, that we can call basically a hip dominant variation. What is the difference between the femur getting smushed to the belly, and now look at a case like this. Take the opposite end of the sort of feet low extreme. Well, why do people generally say that feet lower equals more quads, which oftentimes is true, but not all the time, which we'll discuss in a second? Well, because when we move the feet lower, look at now the relationship between the shin and the femur or the thigh. Well, if we use that same sort of marker example, if this is where we're pressing, if instead of at this angle, right, we just had the shin, which was sort of pushing the femur back toward the belly, well, now all of a sudden, because the foot is at this angle, what is the leg press trying to do to our bones? Well, instead of pushing the thigh bone back to the belly, now all of a sudden the foot is being smushed toward the butt. In other words, if you picture that same relationship, now here's the shin again, here's the thigh. Watch what's happening now between these two. If the foot is down here and this is where the contact is, these two bones are actually being smushed together, kind of like a scissor or something like that, right? They're basically putting themselves, this stick figure person is putting themselves in a position where the foot is being smushed toward the butt. So far we have two major things. The foot is being smushed sort of toward the torso so that the femur, the thigh, is being compressed toward the belly. So we have situation one, thigh being pushed to belly. Situation two, foot being pushed to butt. What the foot being pushed toward the butt actually means is that all of the force in this scenario, or at least a vast majority of it, is going to the knee. Why? Well, because the knee is being bent, right? If you think about, this is the knee here, the shin and the femur are being smushed together like this, whereas in this scenario, the shin is pushing the femur backward. So I hope you can very clearly now see the difference between these two. Don't worry too much about like what are the particular physics, what are the moment arms, what are the torques, if you've heard of those terms. Just think about bones and ask yourself, what is the foot plate doing to the body? So again, brief recap before we move on. Here, femur smushed toward belly, and what that means is more hip dominance, i.e. glutes, adductors. And here, we have more of a quad dominance because the foot is being smushed toward the butt, and the knee is the thing that is being smushed together rather than the hip joint. Okay, so we have two extremes here. Now, where do these hard rules sort of start to fall apart? Well, let's look at the first one here. If we have our feet high, people say feet higher equals more glutes. Well, what if I just erase this person's shin, and instead of drawing it there, I just took the extreme of this and put the foot all the way up here? Well, now what is this force trying to do? Well, there are some, I think, greater degrees of nuance involved in this, but the short of it is basically that if you move your feet up high as high as you can, because you assume that higher is better, but you forget about potentially what might happen as a consequence of just continuing to go higher. Well, in this particular case, a helpful sort of analogy is to imagine what would happen if this foot plate all of a sudden turned into a sheet of ice. Where would your feet slide, right? And the answer is obviously your feet would slide upward. So actually a huge portion of this force is actually no longer just pushing the foot this way. Because of that frictional element, the force direction now moves a lot more like that. It moves much more downward. And if it moves more downward and we ask that question again of like, well, what is then this foot plate doing to this shin? Well, now we're back to this example where a lot of this force is actually being now put back into the knee, because if you picture our marker example here, here are the segments. If there's a force that is now pushing the foot down like this, right, where are we back to? We're back to a situation now where the foot is in essence being swung sort of down toward the hip. Right? So this is a bit of an extreme example and illustration, but I'm trying to prove the point that we can't follow these hard rules in every scenario because there are many exceptions, this being one of them. But ultimately, even in this example, we can still ask, what is the foot plate trying to do to the foot? And as a consequence, what is happening to the shin and the femur? So again, if you sense that your shin and your femur are being smushed toward one another like this scissor, right? Quad dominance. If we took that first example, again, where the shin was fairly close to 90 degrees from the foot plate, and we're imagining that now the foot plate is pushing this backward. Again, now we're talking about this gap being closed here versus this gap being closed right here. Now, what is this third example all about? Well, there are leg presses that don't function linearly, meaning they don't just slide side to side in a single straight line, but they actually arc, and so they kind of swing like a pendulum. Right? And so if we are in a situation, let's say, where our knee bend is substantial, i.e. what people generally would refer to as like a quad dominant variation, well, even though our knees are bent here, we have to look at what the foot plate is actually doing to the bones. And when it gets to this portion of the range, when it's sort of the foot plate is swinging upward and sort of toward our face in this position, even though the knee is bent, what is happening to the foot? Well, the foot is kind of sort of being lifted upward. And so now we're sort of back more toward a variation like this, where even though there's a ton of knee bend, the force direction is actually pushing the knee upward, i.e. the force plate is much more closing the gap between these two bones right here than it is these two bones right here, right? Because what we would have to do in this scenario to actually get a quad dominance is we would need a foot plate that's kind of pushing more like this, so that then the gap between these two would be closed. So I hope this is a very simple and practical takeaway for you, which is regardless of the leg press, the squatting variation that you're doing, you can simply ask yourself, is this force smushing and closing the gap between my femur and my trunk, femur and my belly, however you want to say it, which would end up being a hip dominant variation? Or is the foot plate smushing my foot toward my butt? No, the way they say that would be, is it smushing my shin toward my femur? In which case we now end up with a quad dominant variation. Of course, there's a blend of quad and glute happening at all times. You can't get rid of one or the other because they're part of this system that all has to sort of work together. But you can really, really create a dominance in what you recruit, and as a consequence, what you make sore, what you feel, what you get a pump in, and what you grow All you have to really understand is this fundamental principle of what is the resistance trying to do to my bones, and then as a consequence of that, which muscles have to act. So again, for quads, smush these two. For hips, smush these two together. I hope this was helpful, and if you have any questions for me, feel free to join my online community. It's a biomechanics community, and you can join it for free. And there are like 2,000 people in there now, so I hope to see you in there, and I hope to be able to answer your questions about anything related to this topic.